The ancient world's deadliest secret wasn't a battle formation or military strategy. It was a liquid that burned on water, couldn't be extinguished, and turned the Mediterranean Sea into an inferno. For 7 centuries, the Byzantine Empire wielded this weapon with absolute dominance, and the formula died with them. Picture Constantinople in 672 AD. The Arab fleet surrounds the city, hundreds of ships blockading the harbour, starving the Byzantine capital into submission. The empire is on the verge of collapse. Then, at dawn, Byzantine warships emerge from the harbour, and something impossible happens. Flames shoot from bronze tubes mounted on their bows, arcing through the air like liquid fire. The moment it touches the Arab ships, the water itself ignites. Sailors dive overboard to escape the flames, only to burn alive in the sea. The blockade shatters in minutes. This was Greek fire, and it shouldn't have been possible. What made Greek fire so terrifying wasn't just that it burned. Fire arrows existed. Pitch-soaked projectiles were common. But Greek fire was different in ways that violated everything ancient armies understood about combat. Water didn't extinguish it. In fact, water made it burn hotter. Sailors who tried to smother the flames with sand or dirt found it spreading instead of dying. The substance clung to whatever it touched: wood, cloth, human skin, and continued burning underwater. The Byzantines deployed it through bronze siphons, essentially ancient flamethrowers that could project streams of burning liquid up to 50 feet. Imagine standing on the deck of a wooden ship, watching an arc of flame shoot toward you, knowing that jumping overboard means burning in the water itself. The psychological impact was devastating. Arab commanders documented their troops refusing to board ships after witnessing Greek fire attacks. Here's what makes this weapon truly remarkable. The formula was one of the most closely guarded state secrets in human history. Only a handful of people knew the complete recipe: members of the imperial family and the master alchemists who produced it. The manufacturing process took place in sealed workshops under armed guard. Ingredients were sourced from different suppliers who never knew what they were contributing to. Workers who handled the substance took oaths of secrecy, backed by execution. And it worked for 700 years. Modern chemists have tried to recreate Greek fire based on historical descriptions. The consensus suggests a base of petroleum, probably naphtha from natural oil seeps in the region, mixed with resins from pine or cedar trees, sulfur, quicklime, and potentially saltpeter. But here's the problem with that theory. None of those combinations produce the exact properties described in Byzantine accounts. The substance supposedly ignited on contact with water, which requires a chemical reaction we still struggle to achieve with ancient materials. It supposedly burned hot enough to melt through ship hulls. It supposedly remained effective even when diluted by seawater. Some historians argue the Byzantines might have discovered a natural petroleum source with unusual chemical properties, perhaps containing compounds we haven't identified. Others suggest the descriptions were exaggerated for propaganda purposes, that Greek fire was simply very good incendiary mixture rather than a miraculous superweapon. But the military results speak for themselves. 2 major Arab sieges of Constantinople failed primarily because of Greek fire. The weapon single-handedly preserved the Byzantine Empire through its most vulnerable period. The recipe eventually died out, likely during the chaos of the Fourth Crusade in 1204, when Constantinople fell to Western European armies. The workshops were destroyed, the master alchemists killed or scattered, and the institutional knowledge vanished. By the time the Byzantines regained control of their capital, the secret was already lost. Later attempts to recreate it failed completely. The empire that had once burned enemy fleets at will found itself defenseless against the same naval tactics it had dominated for centuries. What's fascinating is how this pattern repeats throughout history. Advanced weapons technology doesn't just require the physical object, it requires the knowledge ecosystem that created it, the specialized craftsmen, the supply chains, the institutional memory. Remove any piece of that system and the technology becomes impossible to reproduce, even when you're holding the actual weapon in your hands. Which brings us to swords that could slice through falling silk. Around 500 AD, while the Byzantines were perfecting their naval dominance with Greek fire, blacksmiths in the Middle East were creating blades with properties that seemed equally impossible. These weren't just sharp swords, they were weapons with internal crystalline structures visible on the surface, flowing patterns that looked like water frozen in steel. The blades could bend without breaking, hold an edge that stayed sharp through entire battles, and cut through European armor like it was cloth. Damascus steel wasn't a single invention. It was the culmination of a metallurgical tradition that stretched back centuries, combining techniques from multiple cultures into something unprecedented. The steel itself came from southern India, shipped as ingots to Syrian smiths who knew how to forge it into blades that would define medieval warfare. But the real secret wasn't in the forging technique. It was in the steel itself, in trace elements and impurities that the smiths didn't even know were there. And just like Greek fire, the knowledge didn't survive. The ingots arrived in Damascus from mines in southern India, shipped thousands of miles along trade routes that connected the subcontinent to the Middle East. Syrian blacksmiths would heat these ingots to precise temperatures, fold and hammer them repeatedly, creating layers upon layers of crystalline structure. The resulting blades displayed those distinctive watery patterns, what we now call Damascene markings. They weren't decorative. They were visible proof of the internal structure that made the steel exceptional. Here's what made Damascus steel impossible to replicate. Modern metallurgical analysis shows the steel contained trace amounts of tungsten and vanadium, elements that created carbon nanotubes and cementite nanowires within the crystalline structure. These microscopic features, invisible to medieval smiths, gave the blades their legendary properties. The flexibility came from the nanowires. The edge retention came from the carbon distribution. The strength came from how these elements bonded at the molecular level. The smiths didn't know any of this. They couldn't see atoms or understand chemistry. They just knew that steel from specific Indian mines, when worked in specific ways, produced superior weapons. Generation after generation refined the forging techniques, but they were refining a process built on materials they didn't understand. Then, in the 19th century, something changed. The exact Indian mines that had supplied Wootz steel for over 1,000 years either were exhausted or shifted production. New sources came online, but the ore composition was slightly different. Slightly. We're talking about variations in trace elements measured in parts per million. But those tiny differences were everything. When Syrian smiths tried forging steel from the new ingots, the techniques that had worked for centuries suddenly failed. The blades didn't develop the same patterns, they didn't hold edges the same way. The flexibility was wrong. Damascus steel, as it had existed, simply stopped working. And because the smiths didn't understand the chemistry behind their craft, they couldn't adapt. The knowledge died with the old material. Stanford metallurgists in the 1980s analysed surviving Damascus blades and found carbon content between 1 and 2%, along with those crucial trace elements. Modern steelmakers can now create similar structures using controlled processes and known chemistry. But the medieval smiths were working blind, achieving through empirical tradition what we now accomplish through scientific precision. That's the tragedy of lost technologies. They often vanish not because the knowledge was deliberately hidden, but because no one understood the complete system well enough to preserve it when circumstances changed. Now imagine a different kind of weapon. Not one that burns ships or cuts through armor, but one that fundamentally changes how battles are fought. A weapon so simple in concept yet so revolutionary in execution that it turns infantry formations into mobile artillery platforms. The Roman gladius gets most of the attention when people discuss ancient swords, and fair enough, it built an empire. But there's another blade that dominated an even larger portion of the ancient world, and its story reveals how weapons transfer between cultures, getting adopted, adapted, and turned against their creators. The gladius hispaniensis, the Hispanic sword. The name tells you everything. Romans didn't invent their signature weapon. They stole it from enemies they were fighting in Spain during the Punic Wars. Celtiberian warriors serving as mercenaries for Carthage wielded short swords with devastating effectiveness in close combat. Roman soldiers, encountering these weapons on the battlefield, recognized something superior to their own equipment. Ancient historians recorded the horror Roman legionaries felt when they first faced these blades. Bodies chopped apart, arms severed completely, heads separated from necks. The wounds were unlike anything their longer slashing swords produced. And Roman military doctrine, unlike many ancient armies, had a built-in mechanism for adopting better technology when they found it. Within decades, the gladius became standard equipment for Roman infantry. But the Romans didn't just copy the weapon. They understood why it worked and built an entire tactical system around it. The blade was roughly 18 inches long, 2 inches wide, designed for both cutting and thrusting. But the real innovation was how they trained soldiers to use it. Roman legionaries didn't hack at opponents. Swinging exposed your arm, your side, vulnerable areas where enemy weapons could strike. Instead, they trained for rapid stabbing motions, 4 thrusts per second, keeping the body protected behind the scutum shield while the gladius darted forward like a viper. 1 stab every quarter second, each one potentially lethal, compared to maybe 1 swing every 2 seconds with a longer sword. The tactical advantage was mathematical. In the time it took an enemy to wind up and deliver 1 heavy slash, a trained legionary could deliver 8 precise stabs. And because the gladius was short, it worked perfectly in tight formation, where soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder. Longer swords needed space. The gladius turned crowded conditions into an advantage. This weapon, combined with Roman discipline and training, carved out an empire that lasted centuries. The gladius itself evolved over time, with different variations appearing as military needs changed. But the core concept remained. A short, brutally efficient blade designed for killing in formation. Yet even this weapon wasn't the most revolutionary development in ancient warfare. Because while Damascus steel was being perfected and Roman legions were stabbing their way across Europe, engineers in China were solving a completely different problem. How do you give infantry the firepower of archers without requiring years of training? How do you turn common soldiers into rapid-fire weapons platforms? The answer was elegant, mechanical, and utterly terrifying to anyone standing on the wrong end of it. The repeating crossbow, the Zhuge crossbow, named after the legendary Three Kingdoms strategist Zhuge Liang, though the weapon predates him by centuries. Picture this: you're defending a fortress gate during the Warring States period, 4th century BC. Enemy soldiers are charging across open ground toward your position. A standard archer beside you can loose maybe 3 arrows before the attackers reach the walls. You're about to fire 10 bolts in 15 seconds. The mechanism was absurdly simple. A rectangular magazine sat on top of the weapon, gravity feeding bolts down into the firing mechanism. You held the crossbow at your hip and pumped a lever back and forth. That single motion cocked the bow, loaded the next bolt, and released it in one continuous cycle. No aiming down sights, no careful target selection, pure volume of fire. The mathematics were brutal. 100 men with repeating crossbows could send 1,000 bolts downrange in 15 seconds. 100 men with regular crossbows or longbows. Maybe 200 arrows in the same time frame. The difference wasn't incremental. It was overwhelming. But here's what made this weapon truly revolutionary: training time. A longbow archer required years of practice to develop the strength and technique for effective combat shooting. English longbowmen started training in childhood. The repeating crossbow, you could hand it to a peasant conscript and make him combat effective in an afternoon. Point in the general direction of the enemy. Pump the lever. Don't stop until the magazine runs empty. The effective range was only 70 meters, with a maximum range of about 180 meters. Compare that to a longbow's 300-meter range and you see the limitation immediately. This wasn't a weapon for picking off individual targets at distance. This was area denial. This was turning doorways and gates into killing zones where nothing could advance without being shredded. The bolts themselves were shorter and lighter than standard crossbow ammunition, which meant less penetration power against armor. But at defensive choke points, you weren't trying to punch through plate mail. You were trying to stop mass charges, break formations, create enough casualties that attackers lost their nerve and retreated. Archaeological evidence from a Chu burial site dates the earliest examples to the 4th century BC during the Warring States period. By the time of the Three Kingdoms era, roughly 500 years later, the weapon had become standard defensive equipment. Zhuge Liang, the brilliant strategist, improved the design and promoted its tactical use so effectively that his name became permanently attached to it. What's fascinating is how the weapon reveals ancient Chinese military philosophy. Western warfare during similar periods emphasized individual warrior prowess. Knights, hoplites, legionaries all required extensive training. Chinese military thought focused on force multiplication through technology. Give adequate tools to adequate soldiers and overwhelm through numbers and efficiency rather than individual excellence. The repeating crossbow remained in use for centuries, appearing in conflicts all the way into the 19th century. But it never spread beyond East Asia, the way other Chinese innovations did. Gunpowder reached Europe and transformed global warfare. The repeating crossbow stayed regional, possibly because its advantages only manifested in specific defensive scenarios, possibly because other regions had different tactical priorities. While China was perfecting mechanical rapid fire, another ancient civilization was solving an entirely different problem. Not how to shoot faster, but how to shoot further and harder than anyone thought possible. Not individual weapons, but siege engines that could tear down walls that had stood for generations. We need to talk about Philip of Macedon, not Alexander. Everyone knows Alexander. His father Philip doesn't get nearly enough credit for the military revolution that made Alexander's conquests possible. And at the center of that revolution was a weapon so simple it seems almost primitive. A very long stick with a pointy end, the sarissa. A pike measuring somewhere between 5 and 7 meters long, roughly 16 to 23 feet. Compare that to the standard Greek spear, the dory, which measured maybe 2 meters. Philip didn't just make spears longer, he reinvented infantry combat. Traditional Greek hoplite warfare was essentially shoving matches between armoured men with shields and spears. The phalanx formation worked, but it required wealthy citizens who could afford heavy bronze armour. Philip looked at Macedonia's resources and saw different possibilities. Abundant forests producing strong timber, iron and bronze mines, and a large population of farmers who couldn't afford hoplite equipment. So he gave them pikes. The sarissa was held with both hands, gripped about 4/5 down the shaft. This meant soldiers couldn't carry the massive shields that hoplites used. Instead, they wore lighter armour and had small shields strapped to their left arms. The formation compensated for individual vulnerability through sheer geometric advantage. When a Macedonian phalanx advanced, there were 5 rows of pike points projecting forward from the front rank. 5 layers of death before you even reached the first soldier. Even if you somehow got past the first row, 4 more walls of spear points waited. The rear ranks held their pikes angled upward, creating a barrier that deflected incoming arrows. From the front, the phalanx was essentially invulnerable. Another phalanx might wear it down through exhaustion, but that was far from guaranteed. The only reliable ways to defeat this formation were breaking its cohesion through terrain, outflanking it, or killing the commander and causing morale collapse. Philip spent 23 years perfecting this system before his assassination. His son Alexander inherited an army that was fundamentally different from anything the ancient world had seen before. At Gaugamela, when Persian King Darius brought his terrifying scythe chariots, those whirling blades of death that were supposed to carve through infantry formations, the sarissa phalanx destroyed them completely. The weapon spread throughout the Hellenistic world after Alexander's death, becoming the standard for pitched battles. But like many revolutionary weapons, it had a fatal weakness that wouldn't be exposed for another century. And the force that would exploit that weakness was marching west from Italy, armed with those short Spanish swords we talked about earlier. Rome's legions were methodical problem solvers. When they encountered the Sarissa phalanx, they didn't try to beat it at its own game. They studied its weakness. That pike formation was devastating moving forward on open ground. But what happened when terrain broke it up? What happened when those 16-foot spears became liabilities instead of advantages in close quarters? The gladius gave Romans exactly what they needed. Speed, maneuverability, the ability to stab 4 times per second when you got inside that wall of pikes. And Roman tactical doctrine was built around getting inside. Military technology often follows this pattern. Revolutionary weapons create temporary dominance until someone figures out the counter. Then the cycle repeats. But some weapons achieved something stranger. They became so dominant in their specific application that nobody ever really replaced them. They just eventually became obsolete when the entire context of warfare changed around them. The chakram falls into this category. A throwing weapon from the Indian subcontinent that sounds almost fictional when you first hear about it. A circular blade with a sharpened outer edge, 12 to 30 centimeters in diameter, thrown like a deadly frisbee. You think this was something Hollywood invented, but the earliest references appear in 5th century BC Indian epics like the Mahabharata and Ramayana, where the Sudarshana chakra was the weapon of the god Vishnu. Here's what made the chakram genuinely terrifying. Warriors carried 7 or 8 of them on their left arm. When they wanted to throw one, they'd place it on their right index finger, spin it rapidly, and release it with a flick of the wrist. The technique was called Tajani. Regular steel chakram could be thrown 40 to 60 meters. Brass versions, which had better aerodynamics, could exceed 100 meters. Contemporary accounts describe warriors who were incredibly skilled with these weapons. The spinning motion combined with the circular blade meant the chakram kept rotating even as it penetrated targets. If you got hit in the arm, leg or neck, it cut clean through. And because users spun their finger along the blunter inner ring, they avoided cutting themselves even while generating tremendous rotational velocity. The Sikh warriors of Punjab adopted the chakram extensively, using it at least until the days of Ranjit Singh in the early 19th century. But eventually, as with most traditional weapons, firearms made them obsolete. Not because guns were more accurate at range. Early muskets definitely weren't. But because firearms required less training, and the psychological impact of gunpowder weapons fundamentally changed battlefield dynamics. Which brings us to perhaps the most mysterious weapon on this list: Greek fire. The Byzantine Empire's secret superweapon that dominated naval warfare for centuries and whose exact composition remains unknown to this day. This wasn't just another incendiary weapon. This was something that burned on water, couldn't be extinguished by conventional means, and struck absolute terror into anyone who faced it. The weapon first appeared around 672 AD, reportedly invented by a Greek-speaking Jewish refugee named Callinicus, who had fled the Arab conquest of Syria. The timing was critical. The Byzantine Empire was under siege, Arab fleets were threatening Constantinople itself, and the Byzantines needed something that would turn the tide decisively. What they got was liquid fire that could be sprayed under pressure from siphons mounted on ships. When Byzantine vessels sailed out with their bows spouting flames, enemy fleets were routed. The psychological impact was devastating. Imagine being a sailor on a wooden ship, seeing another vessel approach with fire pouring from its front, knowing that if those flames touched your ship, water wouldn't save you. The fire would keep burning on the surface of the sea itself. The Byzantines used this advantage repeatedly. In 718, after suffering a 1-year blockade, they deployed Greek fire again and destroyed another Arab fleet. For centuries afterward, Byzantine naval dominance was partially built on this weapon, and the empire guarded its secret fanatically. The formula was known only to select individuals within the Byzantine court, including the emperor himself. Modern scholars speculate the composition was likely petroleum mixed with resins, pitch, sulfur, possibly lime and bitumen, comparable to modern napalm in some ways. But despite numerous attempts by rival powers to replicate it, nobody succeeded in duplicating both the formula and the deployment method during the Byzantine period. The secret died with the empire. What's fascinating is how many ancient weapons depended on secrets that couldn't survive technological or social change. Damascus steel blades stopped working not because the technique was lost, but because the raw materials changed. When 19th century mining regions shifted, new steel ingots from India had different impurities. The swordsmiths didn't understand that the material itself was the secret, so when composition changed, Damascus steel disappeared. Greek fire vanished for different reasons. The knowledge was deliberately restricted, and when the Byzantine Empire finally fell, that restricted knowledge died too. Nobody had written it down in a way that survived. The empire had protected its military advantage so carefully that it protected it right into extinction. This raises an uncomfortable question about technological preservation. How much knowledge have we lost simply because it was too valuable to share? How many innovations disappeared because they were secrets rather than public knowledge? Ancient weapons represent not just martial technology, but entire systems of knowledge about metallurgy, chemistry, materials science, and engineering. When those weapon systems became obsolete, much of that knowledge evaporated. The ancient engineers who created these weapons were solving complex problems with limited tools and materials. They were innovating under pressure, often literally life and death pressure. And what they achieved, from Damascus steel's molecular structure to Greek fire's thermal chemistry, from the chakram's aerodynamics to the sarissa's geometric warfare principles, demonstrates that ancient doesn't mean primitive. It means working with different constraints to reach solutions we still find remarkable today. The weapons we've explored weren't just tools of war. They were concentrations of human knowledge, entire traditions of craftsmanship and engineering compressed into objects you could hold in your hands. Some, like Damascus steel, depended on accidents of geology their creators never understood. Others, like Greek fire, were guarded so carefully that secrecy itself became their undoing. What unites them all is this: they represented the absolute cutting edge of what their civilizations could achieve. And then, one by one, the knowledge behind them slipped away into history, leaving us with artifacts we still struggle to fully explain.